Well, good morning, you guys, and welcome to my channel. I am Crystal, and this is Homemaking on the Homestead. I made that coffee, and then all of a sudden I had farm life going on around me, goat issues, tree falling down that my husband's dealing with now, and it's just, life. But I'm back now. I have a little time to sit and chat with you guys, so I am going to do that while I enjoy my coffee this morning and talk to you guys about my one word, or one word I had in the past, and I have a little story to share with you with that as well. It's a very common thing to pick, for people to pick a word for the year. I don't know if you are familiar with that. If you're not, I can leave a link to the website that kind of, I think, started all that. And I've been doing it for years and years. So I'm not so much going to talk today about my word for 2023, which I will do in another video. This year I have picked the word contentment for my one word, but I'm going to share with you a story about a year. 2018 was the year, and I picked the word joy, and it was there's quite a story that goes along with that. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this was because sometimes I think that we pick our words, and in our mind we have some sort of reason for that, like do you want to be more focused, so your word for the year might be focused. Maybe do you want to live more intentional, so you pick the word intentional. Do you want to live simpler? You have plans to downsize and you want to simplify your life, or something like that, so you pick the word simple. There's always a reason that we pick the word, and then there's a certain expectation that we have of what that word means and what we may do throughout the year that reflects that word. So in 2018, I picked the word joy, and it was quite an interesting process. As 2017 came to an end, I always pray about my word because I wanted to have some sort of meaning in my life. So I'm always praying for it, and it's like when I latch on to the word that is my word for the year, it's like I know that that's my word. I know this is what I need to be focusing on. And it got all the way to New Year's Eve, and I had not picked my word yet. I went to bed that night and I prayed that the Lord would just make that word so well known to me, and that I knew it beyond a doubt, that this was what I needed to be focusing on this year. I woke up in the morning, and the first word that came to me was joy. And everything in my being was like, yes, this is the word I need to focus on. There was, it's not so much that I felt like I needed joy in my life at that point. I just felt like focusing on the things that are joyful was really going to be an important part of my year. I felt like joy it can be so easily covered up by a lot of negativity, things that happen in our lives, that we don't oftentimes really focus on joy as much as maybe we should. Those were the thoughts in my mind as I began that year. 2017 had been a very difficult year for me, and that was another reason I chose to pick joy, is because 2017 had not really been that joyful for me. I was dealing with double vision and going through a lot of testing to try to figure out why. I had been in the hospital with bleeding ulcers that required 4 blood transfusions and 4 days in the hospital. And there was just a lot of difficult things. I had an ongoing issue with acid reflux, heartburn that was very severe. So it wasn't your typical, eat something bad that night and you get heartburn. This is something that literally I could barely even get a night's sleep due to it. It was the reason that I had all those bleeding ulcers. By October of 2017, my GI doctor had told me that I basically had 2 choices at that point. I either needed to stay on medication like acid blockers for probably the rest of my life, or I needed to go have surgery to fix the problem, which was a hiatal hernia. It's when your stomach starts to come out of your esophagus, most likely caused by 8 pregnancies. They take a toll on your body after a while. But so after a lot of discussion with my husband and prayer or whatever, I just decided, hey, let's just do the surgery, because that way I can fix the problem and move on to a better year. Also at that time, the problem with my eye had been diagnosed, and I was due to have surgery in 2018 for that as well. And I did, and that was fine. But the surgery was scheduled for my hiatal hernia was scheduled for the middle of January. It should have been a surgery that I check in the morning. They do the surgery. I spend one night in the hospital so they can make sure that I'm swallowing and liquids are going down and everything's good, and then I get to go home. So that seemed simple enough to me. Everything went great with the surgery. It's called a stomach wrap. They did it. Everything was fine. So the last thing they needed to do was to do a scope, to go down my throat, to look into my stomach, to make sure that everything was open, that liquids would be able to pass through and all that. There was a doctor in training who was working with my doctor. When he went to do the scope, he ended up ripping a 4-inch hole right down my throat, right down the back of my throat. It was, it was just a horrific mistake by that doctor in training. And I woke up, I don't even know, I think it was probably a couple days later. I'm in the ICU. I was very disoriented. I had no idea what had happened. They had me heavily sedated. They had me on pain medications because after the throat rip, they ended up having to do emergency surgery, call in an ear, nose, and throat doctor to repair the hole, and that's what caused me to end up in ICU over it all. And I woke up just feeling very confused. I had no idea what had happened. And it was probably the most frightening and horrific experience that I had ever had in my life. And even though apparently I had family members telling me, my husband mostly was there telling me, what was happening and what was going on, it did not register to me at all. So I felt like for the first day or two, I was in a nightmare that I could not wake up out of. So I did start to come to. One of the first things I remember was one of my daughters walking into the room to talk to me. And this is a daughter that at the time lived in Kentucky. And I was just like, I was totally in shock. It's like, why is my daughter from Kentucky here? What is going on? Well, I found out later that all of my children came to the hospital when this happened. And of course, I'm 2 or 3 days into it, and by that time, all of my kids had been in communication, and they had been rallying for me through prayer and through actually coming and staying at the hospital. They were taking shifts at the hospital where some would stay, some would come back to our house to eat and sleep. They would let Dad go home so my husband could get some sleep and eat, knowing that if anything happened that they would be calling him and letting him know. So they were basically taking around the clock care. According to what they have told me, the whole waiting room was filled with all of my family. My best friend, who lived 3 hours away, had dropped everything in her life, and she had a very busy life, and drove to the hospital. She was there for the whole time, and would come in and see me as I was coming in and out of consciousness. Eventually they were able to get me to a stable point, and I was able to get out of ICU. I was there for 6 days. The biggest thing is that after 5 days, according to the nurses that were there at the hospital, after 5 days, you lose about half of your body strength. And so just for me to get up out of bed and to walk, I needed to use a walker. I had lost so much strength. I desperately wanted to get home, and so eventually they were able to send me home. After a couple, 2, 3 more days in the hospital, they let me go home. But I went home with a stomach tube in because of the throat injury. I couldn't eat anything or drink anything by mouth, so I had to be fed through a stomach tube. I had to have physical therapy come. I had a nurse that came 2 to 3 times a week to make sure I check my vitals and help me get through any issues or problems I was having. I had an occupational therapist that didn't last very long because I actually was doing things pretty good, so they weren't too worried about me. And I had a speech pathologist that came, and her job was to teach me how to swallow. It had destroyed all of my muscles in the back of my throat, so I no longer could swallow. I no longer knew how to swallow. Those muscles just weren't working anymore. Something that seemed so simple that we take for granted, I couldn't do. It also ripped through my voice box and damaged part of my voice box, which is why my voice is kind of low. And I know I've had people comment on that before. Well, that is the reason why, is the damage that was done to my voice box. Anyway, so in all of this, as I struggled to recover from this and to just make sense of it all, try to recover, it took me a little while, but I was reminded of my word for the year, joy. And it was like how, when you are walking through struggles and you are walking through maybe some of the most difficult things you've ever had to deal with in your life, how do you find joy in those things? I really thought about that, because I had a lot of time as I was recovering where I was in bed, and it gave me time to just focus on that. And as I would pray, it was really interesting when I got to the point where I could actually eat and drink by mouth enough that the doctor could remove the feeding tube. I said, there's a joy. There is a joy. That happened, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks later after the whole surgery, when I thought about the fact that all of my children and their spouses and grandkids and everything many of them came from out of state, because as you know, I have a lot of children that live out of state. And many of them drove miles, flew in, and all to be there for me in that waiting room, praying for me and encouraging me and being there together as a family. I felt joy in the fact that my best, dearest, oldest friend came and spent those days for me, with me. She was there because when her and I had been friends over the year, our children grew up together. She was almost like a second mama to my children, and so she was there encouraging my children, loving on my children, and helping them get through this too, because it was very touch and go for me for quite a while. And so everybody was very concerned, and she was there to encourage and support them. What a joy there is in that. As I regained my strength and I began walking, that was a big thing for me. I needed to learn to build my strength and to walk, and every day I would go outside, I would walk, and I would walk a little bit farther and farther. I started doing some exercises in joy, and one of those was to just stop and listen. And by this time it was spring, and the birds were just incredible. The sound of the birds was it was like music. It's so easy in our busy world to just kind of brush that aside because we're not paying attention. But at that moment, I felt like I was really seeking joy. And it brought me such joy just to hear those birds. The spring rains had been very heavy that year, and there were several creeks around my area that were just gushing. And just to hear the sound of those creeks and the sound of the birds, my neighbor had their baby calves, and I could hear the mamas and I could hear the babies. Again, those were things that for me brought me a whole lot of joy. And the year continued like that. I started to pull out scripture verses on joy, rejoicing, and finding that thankfulness and joyfulness go hand in hand. That joy isn't necessarily based on our own current circumstances as much as it is on what we allow ourselves to find, to seek joy. And when we find it, it's just amazing. It creates the most joyful feeling inside, and it gives us that strength. And I know my favorite verse, of course, the joy of the Lord is my strength. That was one that I would just repeat over and over and over again as I sought for joy in my life in 2018. I think the bottom line, in order to bring this all full circle, is that oftentimes when we choose a word, we need to be open to allowing the Lord to show us how that word is going to play out in our year, because we really don't know. We don't know the future. We don't know what's around the corner. I certainly had no idea in January when I picked joy that that was what I was facing that year. And we need to be able to be open to what the Lord has. And sometimes those words that we pick may take a different direction than what we had originally thought. But to always be open to what the Lord is trying to teach us through that one word. I think it's a great exercise to pick a word. Honestly, there have been years that I pick a word, the year moves on, and then I forget. I can't even remember what my word was, So I'm not saying every year is dramatic or every year is something in awe, but oftentimes we have to be willing to just, like I said, be open to what the Lord is, how He's leading our life, and see what He might be able to teach us through our one word. All right, you guys, I hope you enjoyed and were encouraged by my story of recovery and finding joy, and to know that year I worked so hard to get myself into shape that by the next year, my oldest son and I were out hiking 6 and 8 miles in a trip on trails up and down in elevation. It was the best year, and it felt so good that even my joy continued on to 2019. So yeah, anyway, I just wanted to share that with you today, and thank you guys all for being such wonderful subscribers, wonderful people, friends, and so many of you are my friends. But I truly count you as my friends. You are just the sweetest people. I appreciate your comments. Let me know in the comments about, your word or any thoughts you have or any of your own experiences on picking your word for the year and how that turned out for you. All right, you guys, I'll see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.